Think of the exhaustion that settles into your bones after a long, drawn-out conversation where you desperately tried to make someone understand your point of view. You walked away not feeling heard, but profoundly depleted, as if a vital piece of your spirit had been siphoned away through your own words. This deep, lingering fatigue is not merely a social frustration. It is a profound and measurable psychological event. Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist, provided the exact framework to understand this invisible drain on our life force through his concept of the persona. It is here, in the fragile architecture of the social mask we wear, that the devastating cost of over-explaining ourselves truly begins. The persona is an absolute necessity for human survival, acting as the diplomatic bridge between our raw, authentic inner world and the rigid demands of society. However, a dangerous psychological inversion occurs when we begin to believe that our existence requires the constant validation of this external audience. When you feel the compulsive urge to explain your choices, justify your boundaries, or apologize for your fundamental nature, you are not engaging in healthy communication. Instead, you are witnessing the persona in a state of sheer panic, desperately working overtime to secure social approval. You are essentially asking the external world for permission to occupy your own reality. This desperate bid for validation triggers a devastating internal mechanism that can be understood as psychic entropy. In the realm of physics, entropy is the inevitable degradation of a system from order into chaotic disorder, a slow bleeding away of concentrated energy. In Jungian psychology, this translates to the rapid draining of your libido, not in the sexual sense, but as your foundational, vital psychological life force. Every time you twist yourself into knots trying to make an unwilling participant understand your perspective, you are actively hemorrhaging this vital psychic energy. You are taking the precious, concentrated power of your inner conviction and throwing it directly into the void. Where does all of this sacrificed energy go once it leaves your psyche? It is swallowed whole by the collective unconscious, the massive, invisible psychological gravity of societal norms, expectations, and historical conditioning. The collective does not care about your individuality. It inherently seeks conformity, predictability, and the smoothing out of all psychological rough edges. When you over-explain yourself, you are offering up your vital libido as a sacrifice to appease this unyielding monolith. You foolishly believe that if you just find the right words, the collective will finally grant you the grace of understanding, when in truth, it will simply consume you. To truly grasp the mechanics of this energetic cost, we must view the human psyche through the core metaphor of the leaky vessel. Imagine your psychological container as a tightly sealed jar, designed to hold the pressurized, potent energy of your core identity and personal truths. A strong, integrated psyche requires this container to be completely impermeable to the shifting opinions, judgments, and demands of the outside world. However, every single unnecessary justification you offer acts as a microscopic puncture in the walls of this vital psychological vessel. Every defensive apology, every frantic text message trying to clarify your perfectly valid actions drives another nail through the structural integrity of your mind. As these punctures multiply, the leaky vessel begins to fail in two catastrophic ways simultaneously. First, your internal conviction, the quiet, unshakable knowing of who you are and what you stand for, leaks out into the unforgiving soil of public opinion. Second, the murky, heavy, and chaotic demands of the external world seep back in through those very same holes. Your internal reality becomes entirely diluted by the expectations, judgments, and misunderstandings of other people. You are no longer a self-contained individual. You are a flooded, sinking ship weighed down by the water of everyone else's opinions. History is littered with brilliant minds who nearly destroyed themselves by failing to understand the fatal cost of the leaky vessel. Consider the tragic, early struggles of the legendary astronomer Galileo Galilei, a man who held a profound, undeniable truth about the cosmos. When Galileo first confirmed the heliocentric nature of the universe, that the Earth revolved around the Sun, he possessed a pristine, self-contained truth. But instead of resting in the unshakable gravity of his discovery, He fell victim to the desperate urge to explain himself to the Roman Inquisition. He believed, quite naively, that if he simply laid out the logic, the evidence, and the rational explanations, the rigid collective would understand and validate him. Galileo poured immense amounts of his psychic libido into drafting exhaustive letters, treatises, and theological justifications for his scientific reality. He was desperately trying to negotiate his internal truth with an institution that served as the ultimate, violent enforcer of the era's collective unconscious. But the Inquisition was not interested in scientific truth, logic, or understanding. They were exclusively interested in maintaining the absolute power of the collective paradigm. Galileo's frantic explanations did not build a bridge of understanding. They merely exposed his psychological vulnerabilities to a hostile predator. His early attempts to justify his reality serve as a dark cautionary tale. Seeking validation from an unyielding collective is a profoundly futile and dangerous endeavor. We may no longer face the literal tribunals of the Roman Inquisition, but the psychological mechanics of this dynamic remain identical in our modern lives. The tribunals we face today are the corporate boardrooms, the family dining tables, the social media comment sections, and the endless strings of digital communication. The collective unconscious still demands absolute conformity, and it still weaponizes our natural desire to be understood against us. To see exactly how this psychic entropy destroys the modern individual, we must examine a clinical archetype we will call the corporate apologist. Enter Sarah, a highly capable mid-level manager who is fundamentally terrified of stepping into her own psychological authority. Sarah is entirely incapable of simply stating a boundary, making a firm decision, or declining a request without attaching a sprawling, anxious manifesto of reasons. If she needs to leave the office at a reasonable hour to care for her personal life, she does not simply state that she is leaving. Instead, she launches into a breathless, preemptive defense, listing her completed tasks, her future schedules, and her personal obligations. She believes she is demonstrating transparency, politeness, and professional courtesy to her colleagues and superiors. In psychological reality, Sarah's constant explanations are nothing more than her persona begging for external permission to exist. She is presenting her leaky vessel to the office, allowing her team to watch her psychic energy bleed out onto the conference room floor. Her colleagues do not respect her supposed transparency. On an unconscious level, they smell the blood in the water. They sense her lack of internal conviction, recognizing instinctively that her boundaries are entirely negotiable because she works so desperately to justify them. With every, just to clarify, every, the reason I'm doing this is, and every preemptive apology, Sarah systematically erodes her own actual authority. A psyche cannot sustain this level of energetic hemorrhaging without eventually triggering a catastrophic internal collapse. Because Sarah's vital libido is constantly being drained to appease the external world, her true, authentic self is left starving and neglected in the dark. This profound internal imbalance awakens the darkest aspects of the Jungian psyche, triggering what is known as a severe shadow possession. The shadow, the repository of all our repressed anger, denied selfishness, and unexpressed resentment, begins to swell with the fury of 1,000 unsaid boundaries. The repressed frustration of constantly having to justify her existence ferments into a toxic, volatile psychological poison. The corporate apologist inevitably descends into a state of severe neurotic burnout, driven not by the workload itself, but by the crushing weight of psychic entropy. Sarah begins to snap at minor infractions, her previously polite persona cracking to reveal a deeply bitter, resentful, and exhausted individual. She feels profoundly victimized by a world that constantly demands explanations from her, entirely blind to the fact that she is the one volunteering her energy. Her constant need to be understood has fundamentally destroyed her psychological foundation, leaving her a hollowed-out shell of defensive anxiety. She proves, through her own suffering, that the relentless urge to explain oneself is never a sign of strength, but a symptom of profound inner weakness. Ultimately, the compulsion to over-explain is the ultimate betrayal of the self, a white flag of surrender waved by a terrified persona. It is the tragic illusion that if we simply bleed out enough of our vital psychic energy, the world will finally grant us the right to our own reality. Whether facing a historical tribunal or a modern corporate office, the act of desperate justification guarantees only the dilution of your internal conviction. You cannot negotiate your truth with a collective that is fundamentally committed to misunderstanding you. The leaky vessel must be patched, the bleeding of the libido must be stopped, and the terrifying realization must be faced. Your reality requires absolutely no external permission to exist. Stepping over this threshold initiates the rigorous Jungian process of individuation, a journey that demands the absolute cessation of all defensive dialogue. This is not a path of gentle self-discovery, but a brutal, deliberate forging of the authentic self away from the prying eyes of society. By refusing to speak the language of justification, you fundamentally alter the architecture of your mind. You transition from a state of external dependency to one of absolute internal sovereignty. The frantic urge to explain oneself is finally replaced by a terrifying, yet exhilarating, commitment to simply exist. To understand the sheer power of this transformation, we must embrace the central psychological metaphor of the alchemical crucible. In ancient alchemy, base metals could only be transmuted into gold if they were placed inside a asterisk vas hermeticum asterisk, a hermetically sealed container that allowed absolutely nothing to escape. Psychologically, your deliberate silence becomes this unbreakable seal. When you consciously withhold the urge to explain your actions, you effectively trap your psychic energy inside your own mind. You create a high-pressure psychological environment where profound internal transformation becomes utterly inevitable. This deliberate silence is never a passive retreat or a submissive withdrawal from the world. It is an intensely active, fiercely guarded containment of your internal reality. When you first stop explaining yourself, the internal pressure will feel nearly unbearable. The deeply conditioned urge to justify your choices will crash against the walls of your newly sealed psyche, desperately seeking a familiar release valve. But by holding the hermetic seal, you force the chaotic, base anxieties of your mind to endure the purifying heat of the crucible. Under this intense psychological pressure, the alchemy of the soul finally begins to operate. The raw, frantic energy of needing to be understood cannot escape, so it is forced to turn inward and fuse with your core identity. This is where the base lead of defensive anxiety is agonizingly transmuted into the pure gold of self-realization. You stop bleeding your power into the void and begin to forge a center of gravity so dense that the external world must bend to it. The fully integrated self emerges from the fire, requiring no translation, no defense, and absolutely no apologies. History provides a flawless blueprint of this unshakable gravity in the legendary encounter between Diogenes the Cynic and Alexander the Great. Diogenes was a philosopher who lived in absolute, uncompromising alignment with his own internal truth, famously residing in a ceramic jar in the streets of Corinth. When Alexander, the most powerful conqueror in the known world, stood over him and offered him any prize he desired, the social pressure to defer or explain himself was immense. Any ordinary man would have instantly shattered his psychological container, vomiting forth justifications and groveling gratitude to appease the emperor. He would have desperately tried to contextualize his poverty to the ultimate symbol of worldly wealth. Diogenes, however, possessed a psyche perfectly sealed within the alchemical crucible. He looked up at the conqueror and simply asked him to step aside, as he was blocking the sunlight. He offered absolutely no explanation for his audacity, no justification for his lifestyle, and no social appeasement to the most dangerous man alive. In that singular moment, Diogenes demonstrated the terrifying power of the fully individuated psyche. By refusing to negotiate his reality, he forced the emperor of the world to submit to the gravity of a man who owned nothing but his own mind. The secret to this legendary display of power lies in the total withdrawal of psychological projections. When we desperately explain ourselves, we're unconsciously projecting the archetype of the judge or the authority onto the person we are speaking to. We elevate them to a position of power over our reality, silently begging them to hand down a favorable verdict. By sealing the crucible and offering silence, you violently rip that projected authority away from the external world. You reclaim the gavel, declaring that the only jurisdiction that matters resides entirely within your own integrated self. To see this alchemical process unfold in the modern era, we must examine the transformation of a figure we will call the silent architect. Marcus was a visionary creative professional whose unconventional designs constantly drew the skepticism and hostility of his firm's traditionalist critics. For years, Marcus had responded to every critique with exhaustive presentations, desperately trying to make his unimaginative peers understand the brilliance of his concepts. His energy was continually scattered, his designs were watered down by compromise, and his professional presence was defined by a frantic, nervous defensiveness. He was entirely trapped in a cycle of endless justification. Exhausted and on the verge of abandoning his vision, Marcus made the terrifying decision to seal his psychological container. During the final review of his most daring project, he presented his designs to the board and then simply stopped talking. When the critics launched their usual barrage of skeptical questions and demanded justifications for his unorthodox choices, Marcus did not take the bait. He calmly stated that the design stood exactly as presented, offering absolutely no further explanations. He provided no defensive rationalizations and no apologies for his creative reality. The immediate aftermath of this silence was a crucible of immense psychological pressure for Marcus. His mind screamed at him to break the seal, to fill the uncomfortable silence with the familiar comfort of over-explanation. The room grew incredibly tense. The critics shifted uncomfortably, and the sheer weight of his unexplained boundaries hung heavily in the air. But Marcus held the hermetic seal, forcing his own frantic anxiety to burn within the closed furnace of his psyche. He refused to project the role of the ultimate judge onto his critics, keeping all his creative energy fiercely contained. By trapping this intense psychic energy, Marcus triggered the profound Jungian principle of enantiodromia. This concept dictates that an extreme accumulation of energy will inevitably transform into its exact opposite. The agonizing tension of his unexpressed defense mechanism reached a critical mass within the crucible. In a sudden psychological inversion, the frantic, desperate anxiety that had plagued him for years collapsed inward and transmuted. It became a state of profound creative autonomy, a silent, unshakable confidence that radiated from his very core. The external reaction to this internal alchemy was instantaneous and undeniable. Denied the familiar friction of Marcus's defensive explanations, the critics suddenly found themselves unmoored, forced to grapple directly with the raw power of the work itself. Because Marcus no longer acted like a man who needed permission to design, his peers unconsciously stopped treating him like one. His refusal to negotiate his reality generated a magnetic authority that commanded absolute, unspoken respect. He had successfully transmuted the lead of professional insecurity into the gold of quiet, undeniable mastery. This is the ultimate reward of the individuated psyche, the cultivation of a quiet, gravity-inducing presence. When you walk through the world without the compulsion to justify your existence, you become a powerful anomaly in a society addicted to noise. People are instinctively drawn to the density of a fully integrated self, sensing a psychological fortitude that cannot be easily shaken or consumed. You no longer need to convince the world of your value, because your value is no longer up for public debate. You simply are, and that is more than enough. The alchemical crucible demands immense courage, for it requires you to sit with the burning discomfort of being misunderstood. But it is only within this sealed, silent forge that true psychological sovereignty is born. Stop handing the gavel to a world that has no right to judge your soul, and let the transformative fire of individuation do its work. Thank you for watching this exploration of the mind. If this message resonated with your journey towards self-mastery, please subscribe to the channel for more.